So as the program chair, it's my distinct privilege to introduce the presidential address. And so I get to introduce Dr. Mackay, actually Dr. Duncan Mackay.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Losi. So my name is Duncan Mackay, and I'm a chief plastic surgery resident at UPenn. Having already heard from one of my great mentors, Dr. Soletti, I'm privileged to share two more great mentors with you all. From a young age, I was told I could be anything I wanted to be, but that Dad had the best job in the world. In addition to decades of residents that he has mentored, I can personally attest that his love for plastic surgery and for his patients is contagious. We will hear from him shortly, but first I have the honor of introducing another great mentor and inspiration, my uncle, Dr. Greg Ash. Dr. Ash trained as a plastic surgeon with Dad in South Africa, but in addition to a practice ranging from facelifts to deep flaps to sacral ulcer reconstruction, he is a true Renaissance scientist. One of the most intellectually curious people I have ever met. His inventions range from an early solar panel to a new type of biodiesel based on sugarcane, which is cheap and plentiful in South Africa. When South Africa was in the heaviest days of the AIDS crisis, he foresaw the immeasurable damage that the impending Great Death of an astounding number of South Africa's parents could have on the country. So Dr. Ash developed a grassroots program called NOAH, or Nurturing Orphans of AIDS for Humanity, that aimed to provide resources to mobilize communities to band together to care for their orphan children, to care for their orphaned and vulnerable children. At its peak, NOAH was helping care for over 30,000 children in 100 communities in South Africa. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ash.
Thanks, Duncan, for what I hope were kind words of introduction. Good evening. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you your president. Donald Roy Mackay holds a bachelor's degree in dental surgery, a bachelor's degree in medicine and in surgery, and he is a fellow not only of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, but also of the Royal College of Glasgow. He's a fellow of the College of Surgeons of South Africa and a fellow of the American College of Surgeons and also of the American Academy of Pediatrics. In South Africa, we would call him an underachiever. Professor Mackay has held or holds 15 academic appointments, most notably the Bill Graham Professor of Plastic Surgery and professorships in the departments of Pediatrics, Orthopedics and Neurosurgery, and Associate Chair of the Department of Surgery at Penn State. Don's life has been one of service. He has served as an examiner for the Board of Plastic Surgery, and after holding various positions at the board over a 14-year period, is a former chair of the board. Don is a member of 11 American societies and associations and has always been prepared to serve these when asked. In many cases, he has ultimately been elected president or chair of these bodies. These include the American Academy of Pediatric Plastic Surgeons, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Council of Plastic Surgeons, the American Society of Maxillofacial Surgery, the Northeastern Society of Plastic Surgery, the Ivy Society, and the Federation of Cleft Lip and Palate Clinics of Pennsylvania. Don is also an editor of the White Journal and of the Journals of Craniofacial Surgery and the Journal of Cleft Palate Craniofacial Surgery. Don has won numerous awards and honors. He has been a visiting professor or invited lecturer all over the world and has a distinguished list of publications in peer-reviewed journals, books, and book chapters. All of this while continuing to serve his community and the world voluntarily, primarily through his church and through Operation Smile, where he is Chief Medical Officer. But all of this you know. My job here is to tell you a little bit about the man, about my brother-in-law and friend. Don is not at all the one-dimensional workaholic that reading his CV would lead you to believe. He is something of a Renaissance man. Passionate about his Scottish heritage, Don is an accomplished player of the pipes. Here he is piping me to my wedding, a talent he no doubt inherited from his wonderful mother Joan, who was an excellent pianist and music teacher. Don is also a legendary cook, and as he does with anything he chooses to do, Don goes full-throated at this. Here we are making a chimera of a duck, a turkey and a chicken for Christmas '97. Any of you who have been fortunate enough to sample his food in Hershey can attest that his efforts are not in vain. He usually greets us when we arrive from South Africa with a delicious creation, which may involve hours of smoking, most recently on a massive smoker bought for him by his residents, but always including meat. Don doesn't allow anything to stop him from achieving something he thinks is worthwhile. A quiet, steely determination we all saw in his dad, David. And the same applies to cooking. While visiting family in Canada, they left a side of beef out of the freezer, which resulted in it freezing solid, the joys of living in the frozen north, and could not defrost it in time to cook the steaks. So this was Don's approach. Don attended St. John's College in Johannesburg, where he played rugby on this field. For those of you who don't know rugby, it is a sport where South Africa excels, having won the World Cup in 1995, 2007, and our current champions here in 2019. In terms of rules, the similarity with football is only in the shape of the ball. We cannot pass the ball forward and so must run it every yard. We do not have a board meeting every first down to discuss tactics, and we wear no pads or helmets. This makes it a very exciting game to watch or play. But this has some consequences, as you can see from Don's knee. Somehow he's managed to avoid the clutches of an orthopedic surgeon while still staying fit on this. Don, of course, excelled at St. John's, achieving a first-class matriculation. After school, Don followed his grandfather into dentistry. He was a professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, before he realized that his true calling was in medicine. Clearly, studying dentistry was not quite challenging enough, as during this time at Wits Dental School, Don had time to excel at one of his other talents. I present to you, pictured here with his grandfather in final year dentistry, the 3 times all faculty University of the Witwatersrand beer chugging champion. It was at this time in the late 70s when I first met Don and he started dating Sue. In case you were wondering why Sue fell for him, I included this picture to show that he wasn't always so craggy looking. To our family, Don is a beloved husband of my sister Sue and father of his 3 boys, Duncan, Andrew, and Callum, first and foremost. Shenna to his grandchildren, and mentor and advisor to the extended family. I would like to end with a line from the St. John's College school prayer. Help us to send forth many, rightly trained in body, mind, and character, to serve thee well in church and state. I would say mission accomplished, Father Nash.
Thanks, Greg. I'm not sure if you're still having power outages in South Africa. I know he was hoping to do that in person. Just as well we had the recording. If you're there, thank you, Bud. And thanks, Dunks. This is really special. So I've seen a lot of the presidential presentations, and I remember them. And it's daunting to have to do that myself. I've had 2 years to prepare it. And I was still working on it this morning. I thought I had it down, and then I got an email from Nick Vedder saying, cut it in half, or, just get it done quickly. So, Nick, here's my version. This is Parliament Square in London. There are 12 statues there of prominent political folks in the life of the British. This is Lloyd George, Winston Churchill. 4 of those statues are not British. 2 are South African. 1 spent 21 years in South Africa, and the 4th is Abraham Lincoln. And the common quality or trait that endeared them to the British was that of magnanimity, or noble generosity. You can consider this the highest virtue in political life. As typified by Lincoln's second inaugural, with malice towards none, with charity for all. Gandhi spent 21 years in South Africa, and it was in South Africa that he developed his philosophy of satyagraha, the truth force, or passive resistance. Mandela led everybody in the country to freedom and the Rainbow Nation. I doubt many of you know much about Jan Christian Smuts, who's the 4th statue. Can you get me some water? Smuts devoted his life to spreading the contagion of magnanimity. Thank you, Joe. He was born in 1870 on a farm called Bovenplaats in the Western Cape. That's this area of the Cape Province, near Cape Town. He's a 6th generation descendant of Dutch settlers. He's a subject of Queen Victoria's, born into the world of empires. He goes to Stellenbosch University in the Western Cape. I know some of you have been there. It's a spectacular countryside. For those of you who haven't, I suggest you do. Some of the finest winelands in the world. At Stellenbosch University, he achieves a double first in science and literature. He gets a scholarship to Christ College in Cambridge and proves to be a truly outstanding academic. He's the first person in Cambridge to take both parts of the law tripos in the same year. This is a unique system to Cambridge, and nobody ever takes those exams in the same year. He's placed first in each with distinction. While he's in England, he writes about the common destiny of the English and the Afrikaners in South Africa. He's often offered a professorship at Cambridge, but elects to return to South Africa and sets up a law practice in Cape Town. He's not very successful at it. He has a bit of an aloof personality. But he supports Cecil John Rhodes, who's the governor of the Cape Province at the time, supports his vision of a unified Southern Africa. And in fact, Rhodes had a far greater vision that there would be a huge imprint of the British Empire across the entire continent. But Smuts in Afrikaner is then betrayed by Rhodes' support of the Jameson raid. And just to put this in context, there are two Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. In the Transvaal, they discover gold, the richest gold fields in the world, and it attracts a huge number of outsiders who rush in to mine the gold. These outsiders are termed Uitlanders. They're not citizens, and they don't have the franchise. What Rhodes and Jameson were hoping to do was to stir an armed insurrection that would overthrow the Republic and add it to the British Empire. They soundly defeated by the Boers at a place called Doornkop. Smuts throws his lot in with President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal Republic. And at 29 years of age, he's appointed the Attorney General. The British are determined to engineer a war. They're determined to take over the Transvaal Republic and to add it to empire together with all the wealth that is there. They increased demands for the Uitlanders, for these outsiders, and ultimately demand the franchise. And they get their war. The two Boer republics declare war against and pit themselves against the might of the British Empire. And initially, they suffer humiliating defeats. You see scenes there of Spionkop and Kalenzo. Their response is they send Lord Roberts of Kandahar with 100,000 troops to the Cape. One of those troops, serving in a regiment called the Scottish Horse, is my grandfather. I wasn't able to find out exactly which John Mackay that was, but he's there. And that's how we came to be in South Africa. Roberts and his army proceed to march all the way to Pretoria with a series of flanking maneuvers, and they defeat the Boer regulars by 1900. Lord Roberts returns to London and leads Lord Kitchener of Khartoum to conclude the war, thinking it won't take long. But there are 30,000 Boer commandos who form groups that fight a guerrilla war that lasts another 2 years. In order to try and control these folks, the British adopt a scorched earth policy. They burn farms, slaughtered livestock, and gather women and children into concentration camps. The first time where concentration camps are mentioned in warfare. The conditions are such that 28,000 Boer women and mainly children die. Jan Smuts leads a commando that invades the Cape Province. He's hoping to get support from the local Afrikaner and Boer farmers in the area and continue the fight against the British. He ties up enormous number of British troops in doing so. He's described as a fearless, outstanding leader. Ultimately, they're worn out and defeated. And Smuts, along with Louis Botha, who you see pictured here, are then become key negotiators in the Treaty of Vereniging that ends the war. And Smuts and Botha then work hard for reconciliation and unity. They also want the Boer republics returned to self-rule. And 4 years later, when there's a change of government and the Liberal Prime Minister Campbell Bannerman is elected, Smuts goes to London and makes a direct appeal. At the time, the British government is involved in trying to settle the fractious Irish, and they've got lots of enemies in Ireland. Smuts says to Bannerman, "Do you want friends or enemies?" And Bannerman is persuaded. The two Boer republics are given self-rule again within the British Empire. And Smuts's comment is, "They gave back our country in anything but name after 4 years. Has such a miracle of trust and magnanimity ever happened before? Only the people like the English could do it. They make mistakes, but they're a big people." The particular glorious irony for me is that Campbell Bannerman was a Scot. Smuts is then the architect of forming the Union of South Africa, uniting the 4 different provinces. In 1914, South Africa enters World War I as part of the Empire forces. Botha and Smuts invade German Southwest Africa, and here they are marching into Windhoek. They defeat the Germans there, and then Smuts leads the forces against the German forces in German East Africa. He's subsequently received as the destroyer of German powers in Africa when he goes to London. He receives all sorts of honors from the King. Lloyd George appoints him to the Imperial War Cabinet. In 1917, the Germans bomb London, and Smuts is given the task of pulling together all the different air arms in the Navy and the Army, and he gets the label as the father of the Royal Air Force. Even before the end of the war, he was thinking of an international organization that would collaborate and prevent war in the future. And this is the League of Nations, quoted as the most radical proposal to emerge from British policymakers. It's the 14th point in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points basis for the peace negotiations. The negotiation results in the Treaty of Versailles. Smuts, Botha, and a well-known economist, Maynard Keynes, plead for magnanimity for the defeated Germans. The Treaty of Versailles is anything but magnanimous. And Smuts's comment is that this treaty breathes a poisonous spirit of revenge, which may yet scorch the fair face, not just of a corner of Europe, but of Europe. Prophetic words. Between the wars, Smuts is prime minister. He then loses an election to the Afrikaners, the anti-British Afrikaners. When faced with the depression, they form a coalition government. And then World War II is declared, and there's a vote within this coalition government as to whether South Africa should join the Allied effort or remain neutral. It's an incredibly narrow vote, but they vote to go to war, which splits the coalition. And there are a lot of Afrikaners in South Africa who are not just sympathetic, but support the German war effort. The South African forces defeat Italy in northern Kenya and Abyssinia, as it was, now Ethiopia, and become part of the 8th Army in the Western Desert. Smuts is in regular consultation with Churchill, the War Cabinet, and he's made a field marshal by the King. He's highly respected. You see pictures there of Smuts with Churchill in North Africa. The two of them crossing to the beaches of Normandy a couple of days after the invasion. His face is on the cover of Life and Time magazine. He's highly respected. And he's thinking again towards the end of the war of establishing an international body that will prevent the scourge of war, which they've now faced twice in their lifetimes. He's elected President of the General Assembly and writes the preamble to the United Nations Charter. The second point in that preamble is that they're determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. But this is not being applied to the entire population in South Africa. In 1947, he receives what he considers his highest honor when he's elected Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. In 1948, he unexpectedly loses an election to the Nationalist Party, and this is the party that then ushers in the era of apartheid. So what can we say about Smuts's view on race? Unquestionably, he was a white supremacist. But living in a country where his fellow Afrikaners regarded him as way too liberal, he knew, as he wrote in the preamble to the Charter, he knew the right thing. But he kicked it down the road. He did so very eloquently. He said, when I look into shadows and darkness, and I feel inclined to shift the intolerable burden of solving that Sphinx problem to the ampler shoulders and stronger brains of the future. He dies in 1950, and this is a statement by Lord Todd, the master of Christ College, Cambridge, in 1970. In 500 years of the college's history, of all its members, past and present, 3 have been truly outstanding: John Milton, Charles Darwin, and Jan Smuts. Our next statue is of Mahatma Gandhi. He was born in Porbandar in India. His father was the chief minister there. He was an unremarkable student. In fact, he drops out of a local university, later goes to study law at University College in London. He qualifies, returns to India, and fails at a law practice. There's a story of him running out of a courtroom where he's paralyzed into inaction because he couldn't cross-examine a witness. And he self-deprecatingly refers to this time in his later years. He said, at school, the teachers did not consider me a very bright boy. They knew I was a good boy, but not a bright boy. I was a dull boy. I couldn't even speak properly. And when I went to South Africa, I only went as a clerk. Well, he goes to South Africa in the employ of one of the Muslim Indian merchants. At this stage, there's a sizable Indian population in South Africa. In the 1860s, the British had imported 200,000 Indians as indentured laborers to work the cane fields, the railways, and some of the mines. And it's in South Africa that he's confronted by racism. Now, he considers himself a British subject. He'd studied law in England, and he's kicked off a train in a notable incident, and this enrages him. And it sets him on a path of resistance for the rest of his life. He unites the Indian community as a political force and develops this philosophy of satyagraha, or the truth force. We think of it as passive resistance. It's not passive. It's non-violent. He protests and organizes protests for all the indignities that the Indian populace is suffering. As the Boer War breaks out, He serves the British effort by forming the Natal Indian Ambulance Corps with 1,100 volunteers. And this is part of his appeal. He says, we Indians have got an ancient culture. And he actually issues some, I haven't put them in print here, some racial epithets referring to black people. And this has raised some concern, obviously, but I'll put this to rest with Mandela's words. He said Gandhi must be forgiven those prejudices and judged in the context of the time and circumstances. We're looking here at the young Gandhi, still to become Mahatma, when he was without any human prejudice, save that in favor of truth and justice. Smuts didn't know how to handle Gandhi. He clearly recognized him as a great man. He tried persuasion, concessions, threats, and eventually prison and hard labor, and nothing worked. And Gandhi's quote in later life is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Smuts is wistful in a lot of his interactions with Gandhi. He says, you know, when we were in England together, I had no prejudice or color prejudice against your people. In fact, if we'd known each other, we would have been friends. And in many respects, your race is more intelligent than we are. You belong to a civilization that is thousands of years old. Ours is but an experiment. Who knows? But the whole damn thing may perish before long. On one of the occasions when Gandhi is in prison, Smuts sent him 2 religious texts. And Gandhi returned the favor by sending Smuts a pair of sandals that he'd made in jail. Years later, Smuts returned those sandals to Gandhi, and they sit in a museum in India. And part of the letter he writes, I've worn these sandals for many a summer, even though I may feel that I am not worthy to stand in the shoes of so great a man. Gandhi's final effort in 1913 is the biggest resistance campaign that he initiates. Gandhi and Smuts compromise, and this abolishes a lot of the Indian tax and a lot of the other indignities, but it did not give the Indians in South Africa the right to vote. Gandhi called off that campaign and departed to India. And we know the story of how he led the resistance and ultimately independence for India. Leave the final word to Gandhi, again to Mandela. In a letter that was smuggled out of prison in 1980, Mandela says, in 21 years of his stay in South Africa, we were to witness the birth of ideas and methods of struggle that have exerted incalculable influence on the history of the peoples of India and South Africa. And finally, on to Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Born in 1918, a great-grandson of a well-renowned Tembu king. So he's part of the royal line, but it's not part of the main line. They call it kind of the left-hand house. He receives an early education at a Methodist missionary school. At that school, he earns the nickname of Tatamkhulu, which means grandfather, and this was to describe his serious, studious nature. He studies at Fort Hare. He clerks for a white law firm in Johannesburg and continues his studies, ultimately getting a degree from Fort Hare and his law degree from Wits University in 1953. That's my alma mater. He forms a law firm with Oliver Tambo, another well-known ANC leader. And during this time, grand apartheid is being implemented in South Africa with the gradual removal of the rights of black, mixed race, and Indian people. It limits employment, movement. The blacks are moved out of so-called white areas into black areas or Bantustans. In order for blacks to work in the white areas, they had to carry this passbook. There are other numerous indignities with increasingly repressive laws. Mandela's political philosophy starts out as Africanist and doesn't see a place for white people in South Africa, but it modifies. And a lot of it is modified by the influence of the Communist Party. He's impressed by the fact that the communists are completely egalitarian. Your color of the skin doesn't matter at all. One of the other players at the time is the Pan-African Congress. And as a young man growing up in South Africa, they were a terrifying bunch. Their slogan was "One settler, one bullet." The ANC continues with its non-violent resistance to apartheid. And in fact, their leader in 1960 wins the Nobel Peace Prize, Albert Luthuli. Their political charter is from the Freedom Charter written in 1956. And the thing that scares white South Africa is that they intend to nationalize the banks, the mines, the means of economic production. In 1956, Mandela and the ANC leadership are charged with treason. Their trial starts in 1959, and it's ultimately dismissed in 1961. But it's interrupted in 1960 by the Sharpeville massacres, where Africans had gathered, burning their passbooks in protest outside of a police station in Sharpeville. The police opened fire, 67 people are killed and 186 wounded. And there's a paroxysm of violence that erupts across the country with shootings all over the place. And it looked like the country was on the verge of a revolution. The state response was tough. There's a state of emergency, there are mass arrests, and they ban the organizations. Mandela used his trials to espouse the political views of the ANC. So throughout its 50-year existence, the ANC has done everything possible to bring its demands to the attention of successive South African governments. It has sought at all times peaceful solution for the country's ills and problems. Every attempt has been treated with contempt and met by force. I was not allowed to pick my company. I was not free from constant police surveillance. I was made by the law a criminal, not because of what I'd done, but because of what I stood for, because of what I thought, because of my conscience. I hate the practice of racial discrimination, and my hatred, I am sustained by the fact that the overwhelming majority of mankind hate it equally. And this hatred can only be removed by the removal of the injustice. These powerful denunciations of the apartheid system were banned in South Africa. You could not see them in newspapers. We could not hear them broadcast over the news. We never saw any of this. But not so the international community. And in a front page article in 1961, the author writes, to most of the world, these men are heroes and freedom fighters, the George Washingtons and Ben Franklins of South Africa. So after the case is finally dismissed in 1961, another warrant for the arrest of Mandela and all the senior leadership is issued immediately. A lot of the leaders leave and go into political exile. Mandela goes underground with other ANC leaders. And eventually the ANC embarks. They decided that the passive resistance is no longer worthwhile, and they embark on the armed resistance. They form an organization called Umkhonto weSizwe, or Spear of the Nation. Mandela's smuggled out of South Africa to canvass for the ANC. He travels throughout Africa. The picture you see there is him meeting Algerians who had just successfully won independence from France. He returns to South Africa 8 months later and continues to organize, but he's captured after 2 years. You see the front page of the Rand Daily Mail, where he's referred to as the Black Pimpernel. At the subsequent trial, he's convicted of incitement and leaving the country without a passport. He gets a 5-year prison sentence. But while he's serving that sentence, an ANC hideout in Rivonia, which is a province a suburb north of Johannesburg, a police raid yields masses of evidence that incriminates the senior ANC leadership in sabotage. They found guilty, and they fully expect to be sentenced to death. So this is Mandela's statement prior to the sentencing. This is his own words from the dock, and I hope we're going to get enough volume here.
I have dedicated my life to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
They're sentenced to life imprisonment on Robben Island. We don't hear much of Mandela. And for the next 14 years, South Africa prospers. Sue and I were brought up in a country with an incredible economic surge and an amazing standard of living. But South Africa is increasingly seen as the bastion of a communist onslaught, as the countries around South Africa become independent and are dominated by communist-leaning governments and the strong support of the communist bloc. There are a series of proxy wars that South Africa fights with the support of the West. And meanwhile, apartheid, if you will, is maturing, so that black areas, the black homelands, are gaining independence. Here, the first is the Transkei, followed by the Ciskei, and then in purple, these patches gain independence as Bophuthatswana. Then in 1976, the government imposes a law that black students need to be taught not just in English, but in Afrikaans as well. And these black kids in the schools in Soweto have had enough, and they riot. You see the iconic picture of Hector Peterson, one of the kids shot and killed on the first day of those riots. Violence is unleashed all across the country. The following year, Steve Biko is killed in police custody. And international pressure mounts. Sanctions, sports boycotts. Any of the ANC armed resistance is ruthlessly dealt with by the South African Armed Forces. When I was a plastic surgery resident, one of my co-residents asked if I wouldn't mind covering for him for the weekend. He came back on Monday, he's sunburned, and he was part of a special forces unit that had gone into Mozambique and taken out an ANC base. Mandela thinks that he can outmaneuver the ANC, and he offers Mandela his freedom as long as he renounces the armed struggle. Mandela's reply comes from his daughter Zinzi, and she reads the statement to a huge gathering in Soweto. And Mandela says, only free men can negotiate. I'm not going to give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. And he challenges P.W. Botha. He said, let Botha show that he's a different man than the previous prime ministers. Let him renounce violence. And I cannot sell my birthright, nor am I prepared to sell the birthright of the people for me to be free. As the pressure mounts, there are a group of eminent businessmen who meet with ANC leadership outside of South Africa. And they're essentially saying to the ANC, we don't care whether it's black people or white people who rule South Africa. We want a country that can be ruled, that hasn't been destroyed by violence and strife. The junior government officials reach out to Mandela, seeing if there's a way forward. And eventually he gets irritated with these guys and says, I'm not talking to you anymore. You can't make decisions. I want a meeting with the Prime Minister. They're encouraged by the fact that Mandela has said, the whites belong here. The whites in South Africa belong here. This is their home. We want them to live here with us and to share power with us. Eventually, Mandela gets his meeting with P.W. Botha, and that's a classic pose of P.W. Botha with his index finger raised and wagging it at you. Look at that picture. Mandela's a prisoner, but he's in complete control of the situation. And many people remark on that, the remarkable self-control, the poise, the presence. An American diplomat who met with Mandela when he was in prison refers to his calm, confident manner, dignified bearing, incongruous in our prison surroundings. Throughout our meeting, I felt I was in the presence not of a guerrilla fighter or radical ideologue, but a head of state. In 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and the Warsaw Pact fractures. The Soviet Union starts to collapse. the communist threat to South Africa is no longer that terrible threat. And the now Prime Minister, F.W. de Klerk, seizes the opportunity, releases Mandela, and unbans all the organizations, including the South African Communist Party. What follows in the ensuing 4 years are tough negotiations. There's factional violence. There's essentially a low-level civil war that carries on in South Africa before they finally agree on a framework for free elections in 1994. Prior to the elections, Mandela and de Klerk jointly win the Nobel Peace Prize. The ANC win most of the seats in a coalition government that's formed. Mandela's elected president, and he makes sure that the two of them, Mandela and F.W. de Klerk, walk into the parliament together to rapturous applause. And at this stage, their relationship had been really strained. They were barely on speaking terms. Mandela felt deeply betrayed by de Klerk. But he reaches out. He said, I want to congratulate him. For the 4 years that we've worked together, quarreled, addressed sensitive problems, and at the end of our heated exchanges, we're able to shake hands and to drink coffee. At South Africa's independence celebration, Mandela says, this is the time for healing, to bridge the chasms, so that all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear, and that they've established a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. To my mind, one of the most civilized things that occurs after the end of apartheid is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is set up by Mandela and led by Bishop Tutu, another prize winner, Nobel Peace Prize winner. And it's a vehicle to reconcile the violence, bloodshed, and killing that occurred on both sides, those in favor of apartheid and those opposing it, where you could come before the commission, confess the sins that you had done or the violence that you had done in the name of or against apartheid, face the victims or the victims' families and ask for forgiveness. And in many cases, they were. If you look at some of the accounts, they're heart-wrenching. But a remarkable, civilized way of dealing with these awful events in the past. It wasn't perfect by any means, but what a great step. Mandela also continues to reach out. So he meets with Betsy Verwoerd. Hendrik Verwoerd was one of the prime ministers who was regarded as the architect of grand apartheid. He goes and meets with her. He meets with Constant Viljoen, who was the leader of the armed forces. South Africa had a huge military at the time. Leading into the election, South Africa had nuclear weapons. As part of the negotiations, it's the only nation in the world to have unilaterally given up nuclear arms and dismantled their program. You saw Greg's reference to rugby. Rugby is a religion in South Africa, particularly amongst white Afrikaners. South Africa in 1995 hosts the Rugby World Cup. Mandela arrives at the stadium wearing South African kit, South African jersey, with the captain's number on his back. And these hardened Afrikaners who were staunchly opposed to any black rule are won over completely and are chanting, Nelson, Nelson. Again, against all expectations, South Africa makes it to the final, and they're up against the perennial Rugby World Cup power, the New Zealand All Blacks. And they win. They beat the All Blacks. I can recommend to you a book called Playing the Enemy. I think in the States it's called Invictus. And watch the movie. That's the Rugby World Cup team. There's only one black player at that time, Chester Williams. So Steve Buckman was asking me earlier today, is there still an animosity between the Afrikaners and the English? Well, yes. Okay, South Africa made it to the final of the 1919 Rugby World Cup, and they're playing England. And so they've had the First and Second Anglo-Boer War, and the third one had been scheduled for the following weekend when South Africa was going to take on England. There's one of the descendants of this tough Boer stock, Ergie Snyman. And they win. To any of my friends and colleagues who have any English connections in their past, they don't just win, they get clobbered. And now it looks like a South African team. It looks like South Africa. The first black captain, Siya Kolisi. So what lessons can we take from these folks? Well, Smuts had this vision for international cooperation through the League of Nations and subsequently the United Nations, and his desire to spread the contagion of magnanimity. Gandhi, in his 21 years, develops the philosophy of satyagraha with a truth force, a model for passive or non-violent resistance that has affected everybody. And Mandela, with his demand for dignity, call for unity and generosity for his captors. I leave you with this. It's a poem that gave Mandela resolve and strength in his long years of captivity, either working in the quarry on Robben Island or staring out through the confines of his cell. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Thank you. Thank you all. It's time for a drink.